So I just want to say that we want to increase funding to all of Canada's arts and culture organizations, and that includes the Canada Council of the Arts, the National Film Board, and Telefilm. But I think this question is kind of getting to this issue of lost revenue from advertisements, and that's why we want to close the loophole that exempts social media platforms from collecting taxes on advertising and ensure all government advertising is placed in Canadian publications. A lot of our ad revenue is being directed to companies like Netflix and YouTube, and we're not actually using any of that money in our own home to create Canadian content. And that's something that we need to address. We need to be continuing to support Canadian content, but also make sure that there's a minimum amount of Canadian content that we're all being exposed to, and that all of that revenue from advertisement is going back into our Canadian broadcasting companies. And that's also why we want to increase funding to the CBC and Radio Canada by $315 million per year, until it's equal to that of the BBC.
Is there a question again?
Will you support both legislation and regulation requiring all players that benefit from the Canadian broadcasting and telecommunications systems to invest in the creation of original Canadian programs?
Okay, that's kind of a weird question because CRTC already regulates Canadian content. It's called CanCon, and it's all Canadian stations and broadcasts are supposed to maintain 35, I believe, for radio and 30 for television in terms of Canadian content. Now, I agree that should be increased by some, but there's already legislation regulations put in place by the CRTC to allow for this kind of culture to happen, Canadian culture to kind of happen within our broadcasting. Now, on terms of things like Netflix and streaming services, I believe they should kind of fall within that same regulatory in terms of Canadian content, because Canadian content is important. However, going along the lines of the CBC, our platform really actually calls for almost the funding of the CBC and kind of turning it more to a PBS kind of model. The only reason why putting it towards a more PBS model is you'll get donations directed from locals, and then this way you can perform more local content, more Canadian local content. Right now there's 5, 6 stations that really control the CBC. And if you're living in Thunder Bay, I really don't want to be worrying about and hearing about the stuff that's going on in just Toronto and worrying about things that are being broadcasted just through Toronto. I believe it needs to be, and we need to put into place that the CBC becomes that local voice again for Canadians, producing our stories, not producing whatever stories they can get to fill their content, including shows from England and from Australia. It should be almost 100% Canadian content in that aspect, but it should be more on a local level, and they should not be competing with CTV and CTV and all these big names if they're getting massive amount of tax dollars.
Hi, thank you so much. Thanks for the question. It's an excellent one. For those that don't know, we're really blessed in Davenport because we are rich with artists, with creators, and those who work in the cultural industry. And so I think it's an important question, and to be honest, I think at the national level, we don't talk enough about artists, cultures, the cultural industry, and how is it that we're going to, in the age where we're moving into the digital age, how we're going to support Canadian content and our artists moving forward. I will tell you that when we were first elected, we did put $1.9 billion into the CBC, Canadian Council for the Arts, Telefilm, Cultural Spaces Fund, those sort of organizations, just because for too long they were actually starved. But we never really looked at how is it that we create on an ongoing basis some sort of sustainability for the CBC and a new way for us to actually be funding creating Canadian content on an ongoing basis. I've been very much a champion at the national level for us taxing our Fangs, our Netflixes, our Amazons, anybody that sort of has our eyeballs in Canada. We did make an announcement in our current platform where we are going to be taxing them, 3% on income, on the income that they actually get in Canada, and we'll also be asking for foreign digital corporations who sell into Canada to collect and pay the same sales tax that their Canadian counterparts have to pay. I'll tell you that, to me, that's not enough, because we don't actually sort of tie into how is it that we make sure that our artists and our and it actually produces Canadian content or goes to producing more Canadian content. So it looks like we're making a promise to actually go and actually tax finally the things in this country. But what I'd like to see and what I'd be fighting for if I was elected and back in government is actually finding a way for that to flow back into whether it's the CBC to help us fund Canadian content or our artists in every way possible. Thank you.